of talking about cannabis very specifically. But now, in light of that recent Chief Constable's report and the one that preceded it, and in light of all the conversations that are happening around cannabis, we actually thought, you know what, now is probably the right time to start having a very public conversation around how we deal with drugs policy on the Isle of Man more generally. So is this approach, which is traditionally termed the war on drugs, it has that. Do we want to carry on with that? Do we want to carry on locking people up for having 3 pounds of cannabis in their possession? Do we really want to keep treating this as an illegal activity, or are we better off saying there's got to be a better way of managing and controlling this? There has to be a better way of managing and controlling how people who want to take recreational drugs can do that in a safe way, because the reality is people are taking recreational drugs on the Isle of Man. That's a fact, and trying to pretend that we're living in a world where it's illegal so it doesn't happen, actually that is a very blinkered approach, and I think that's where we're at the moment. In purely in legal terms, we seem to think that actually if we make it illegal we can stop it from happening, and the reality is, as we all know, that isn't the case. Making something illegal doesn't just stop it from happening. And
that's the same with heavier drugs as well, isn't it? So you don't just make something legal to make it safe necessarily. There's got to be a line. Yeah,
absolutely. And what we're not advocating at this point is absolutely just go the whole hog and legalise everything. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is saying let's try and have a more gradual and more targeted approach, perhaps. So when you look at the Chief Constable's report, he very specifically references the harm that's caused by Class A drugs, and that's what you would normally consider to be things like heroin and LSD and more serious issues. And the harms that are caused by those are much broader and much more significant harms. But because of the way that the drugs trade sort of works, I suppose, there is always going to be that link with, if I'm going to go to a dealer and buy cannabis illegally, well, there's a good chance that you might offer me something a bit stronger, something else. And so part of the conversation has to be around, actually, what harm are we trying to stop here, and what is the best way of stopping that harm? That's what all this boils down to for me, and I think for my party colleagues as well. That's what this boils down to. It's not about making something legal or illegal for the sake of it. It's not making something legal or illegal because we think that's good or bad. It's all about saying, well, actually, we accept that every type of drug, alcohol, tobacco, cannabis, heroin, it all has harms associated with it. What's the best way of minimising those harms? What's the best way of saying, how do we stop people from having really bad effects, really bad impacts of some of this stuff? And largely, we're not just talking about the effect on the individual, we're talking about the effect on society, we're talking about all the criminal activity that goes around the illegal drugs trade. And if there's something we can do in policy terms that says, actually, if we were to treat cannabis slightly differently, maybe we'd cut off a funding element for some of these criminal gangs, because there wouldn't be a market for it anymore. There's not a lot of bootlegged alcohol that gets sold these days, because actually you can buy what you want quite legally, quite safely. And so, really, that's where the party has come to on this situation, is to say, actually, let's start having a conversation. Let's start this public debate. And it might very well be that actually we go into this, we have a public debate, and the Manx public says, you know what, actually, we're quite happy with the way things are going. We just think we should throw some more resources at the police and let them try and deal with this in the way we have been dealing with it for the past 30 or 40 years. It might be that actually the Manx public says, you know what, I'd much rather the police be focusing their efforts on the significant issues and the harm that's being caused by more serious drugs. And actually, I don't really want them locking people up for
So what's your stance then? Is it that you want to legalise cannabis for recreational and medicinal use, depending on what the public say?
No, I think our stance is it's a bit broader than that, actually. So the stance that we're taking is that really we need to take a step back and look at the way we treat drugs across the board on the Isle of Man. And I think,
as a party, how do you think we should treat drugs?
So the view that we've come to actually is that in terms of cannabis use specifically, that the harms that are caused by that are much lower actually than the harms that are caused by Class A drugs, and that there is definitely an argument to be made to say, actually, we need to break that link. We need to find a way of breaking that link so that whatever people are choosing to do, which we know they are choosing to do anyway, is there a better way of dealing with it? We as a party think there must be a better way of dealing with it. That is the million-dollar question, unfortunately. So there's a broad conversation around decriminalising, so saying actually having small amounts of possession is okay. We're not going to prosecute you for that.
But you're not quite willing to say that's what you advocate yet?
Not yet. And the reason for that is quite simply that we haven't had that public conversation. And at the end of the day, we live in a democracy, and the best thing to do, in my view, is to actually talk to the people that live here and say, what do you think is the right thing to do?
Well, we're coming up to election next year, so when people are voting, I mean, we have very few party politics on the Isle of Man, but we do have the Liberal Vannin Party. So if they're looking, and that's a really key issue for them, are they looking at you and saying, your stance is to decriminalise, or is it you're on the fence? Because that is something that will set you apart.
No, that's very true. Actually, my personal view, and this isn't a view that the party has adopted, but my personal view is that actually we would probably be better off looking at legalisation in a broader context and saying, actually, let's manage, let's regulate, let's control this so we can actually have a positive impact on the negative effects that we see on society. But I haven't managed to convince all of my party colleagues that we should adopt that, and again, that is quite a radical approach, I think, and is an approach that has been tried elsewhere and is showing results in other countries. But I don't feel it would be appropriate for us as a party or me as an MHK to say we should do this until we've gone through that public engagement process, because at the end of the day, I'm not here to tell people what's right. It's my job to listen and say, let's roll out what it is you think is appropriate. It's a society we all share. Hopefully, if we can start having that conversation now, by the time the election rolls around next year, we'll have a much clearer picture, actually, on what people think might be appropriate for the Isle of Man. But we can't know that until we start having those conversations.
You do run the risk, of course, as we are approaching an election, that you want to be clear about your policies, because if you say, well, it's up to you and I might change my mind, that could very much seen as electioneering, because you can backtrack on it, can't you?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, and that is a risk. I think we're going into this at the moment with a very open mind, saying we are very much in favour of reforming the way we deal with drugs on the Isle of Man. That is absolutely the party policy position. What that reform should look like, I think that's the detail. That's what we need to talk about, and it could very well be that by the time we get to the next election, we haven't managed to have that open and frank public conversation, and we haven't got a fixed position. That's the nature of the beast, unfortunately. I would very much like us to be in a position where we would be going into that next election with a very clear view on a lot of things, actually like this, and say this is absolutely where we would take it. If you vote us in as a majority, we'd be doing this. But I think it all has to start with that public engagement, and I think the part of the issue we have is a lot of this is in the hands of various government departments, a lot of it's in the hands of Home Affairs or the Health Department, and trying to get them to get on board with this conversation, I think, is going to be the biggest challenge, is saying we think we should have a public conversation about this, whereas if they turn around and say, no, we're very happy with the way things stand, thank you very much.
Are you in a position then to, say, hold a public meeting or launch a consultation, the normal ways? Is that something you'd be looking to do next?
Well, we had a public meeting on the 9th of November, actually, which was online and was freely available to anyone that wanted to attend. It may be that we host another one of these, maybe we have a series of them. My intention would be actually to start the ball rolling by trying to have a debate in Tynwald, to say, actually, can we get Tynwald on board with the idea that, at the very least, what we're doing today isn't working, and we need to have a good hard look at what the future should look like. I would like to think that my Tynwald colleagues would always be open to having a public conversation, a public debate around any big kind of policy changes, so I don't see that would face a lot of resistance. I'd hope it wouldn't face a lot of resistance. And provided we can get them on board, then maybe we can get the departments in government with the experts in to actually start having these public conversations, maybe a full-on consultation on what the future might look like. But I think the start point has to be, let's get clear in our own minds what the risks are, what the positives are, and actually have a look at what's been done elsewhere. And that requires a lot more professional work, I think, than we can do as a party.